Hi, today we're going to demonstrate how to use the Photoshop action in Sean Archer's Portrait Master. First, you'll need to install the action. It's super easy. You just go to your Actions tab, then click in this little menu on the top right and hit Load Action. From there, you will navigate to the downloaded Sean Archer folder. We're focusing on Photoshop Action, so we'll click into that. You'll see there's a folder for background textures, Photoshop CC, and Photoshop CS6. Now I'm using a version of Photoshop CC, so I click into that. As you can see, there are two different action versions for CC. One for Photoshop CC 14 and one for Photoshop CC 19 through 20. I'm using the most recent version, Photoshop CC 19 through 20, so I'll open that one. So when it first loads, the actions are viewed in normal mode. To make it simple, you're going to want to go back to the Actions menu and select Button Mode. Now, often when you first go to Button Mode, the Actions window may display the buttons in two columns. I find that confusing. So what you do is simply drag the tab window to shrink it until it gets to one column. That looks much better. So the actions are organized sequentially to guide you through Sean Archer's post-processing methodology. If you click the top button, it really doesn't do anything but give you an overview, and it reminds you to put the actions into button mode. The actions that process your image are all numbered and colored orange. All right, ready to run our first action called Legacy Action. Here we go. First thing it tells us is to balance our image. So it brings up the Camera Raw filter, where you want to try to get a good light balance on your image. If you're new to balancing your image, you might want to click Auto and adjust it from there. I'm just going to make some small adjustments. Don't worry too much about the background, because we're going to add a new background texture and work with the color on that later. So focus on your subject. I think in this example, her skin is just a bit too magenta, so I'm going to dial that back a bit. So click OK. Now keep in mind with the Portrait Master, all adjustments are non-destructive. You could just go back to this layer, double click on the Camera Raw filter, and adjust it at any time, because they're all non-destructive. So the next thing this action prompts us to do is to create a subject mask. The instructions tell us that it's going to bring up the Select and Mask window. Now it's slightly different in the versions for CC14 and CS6 because Select and Mask is a new feature in the latest version of Photoshop. In the older versions, there's a slightly different approach to this step, but you could just follow the instructions that pop up to get a great mask in those versions as well. And once the mask is complete, the actions work the same way for all versions. So click Continue. So in the Subject Masking tool, what you want to do is click the letter R on your keyboard to select the Refine brush. Now I'm going to make the brush a little larger by clicking the closed bracket. The open bracket makes the brush smaller. We want the brush to be nice and big to cover both the hair and the background. And I'm going to just paint along the hair, keeping the plus sign right in the middle. As you can see, it cleans up that whole edge so nicely, especially around the hair. Now, looking at the shoulders and neck, it looks like we can clean that up a bit too. So I'm going to reduce the size of my refine brush and paint down the neck and shoulders so it smooths it out. So we could tweak these global refinements to help out a bit. I like to add just a bit of feather and just a bit of contrast. It tightens it up just a little bit more. And then I like to shift edge in just a little bit. As you can see, there's a little halo on her shoulder here. This brings the edge in just a little bit. Watch out not to do too much, as you can see a bit of black on the edge. Let's use maybe half that. And that looks good, so click OK. So because several of the actions in this pack will use this mask, it wants to be sure it's nice and tight, so it brings up a final window to check your mask before moving on. This lets you eyeball everything and clean up any details. If you need a little cleanup, the action has already set it up for you with a white brush to clean up anything on your subject. So looking at our subject, it looks really good, but you could see just a little bit of red peeking out through her hair here. So I'm just going to brush it away. Now it's important to make sure your brush opacity and flow are both at 100% to do this. So I'm just going to brush that all away. Okay, so this looks really good. So I'm going to continue on this action. Notice the button has turned bright red. That means the action is currently being played, but it's on pause, waiting for us to execute the instructions. I'm just going to click the red button to continue with the action. The next thing the action does is give you some background lights. The first thing you have to do is put the light into position. It often looks great next to the shadow side of the subject. Now this is important. Once you have the light set, you'll need to hit the Enter key on your keyboard, and that's the Return key on your Mac. Alright, click Continue, and there it is. You can move it up, you can move it around, and you can see that it only affects the background. You can grab a handle and resize it. You can even reshape it by holding the Shift and Alt keys. Now that's the Option key on the Mac. So I'm going to make the light a little larger, just enough to give her a glow just behind her head and to the right. Alright, that looks pretty good. Remember, I have to hit the Enter key to continue on. Okay, the next thing the action guides us to do is to adjust the opacity and blend mode of this light. You might want to try out the overlay or the soft light blending modes. They have a slightly different effect on your background. I'm going to use overlay on this image, but you could use any blend mode you like. Keep in mind, you can always change this setting later because it's all non-destructive. And I'm also going to adjust the opacity of this light as well. As you can see how that changes the intensity. I'm going to use 80%. Again, I may tweak that setting later after I've run all the actions. Click OK to continue. Now it brings up a second light, and it asks us to do the same thing with this light. So again, I can resize and reshape the light. I can also rotate it just by positioning the cursor right outside the border, so it switches to the rotate cursor. So I'm going to put this close to where the first light is, just to enhance it slightly. And then I'm going to hit the Enter key. That's Return on the Mac. So just like light 1, it's asking again to adjust the opacity and blend mode. I'm going to drop this way down just to add a little more light to light 1, just sort of highlight the first light. Click OK. Okay, so now the action is prompting us to add a background texture that was included in my download. So click Continue. Open the Portrait Master folder. And inside the Photoshop Actions folder, you'll see a folder called Background Textures. Open that folder. Select the background and click Place. And it places it in the center. Now you can move this around, resize it, and reposition the background however you want it. That looks pretty good to me. Now I hit the Enter key and it places it. Now it's prompting me to adjust the background color to complement my subject. My subject has greenish blue eyes, so I'm going to try to match her eyes. Click Continue to do that. And a new color balance adjustment layer has been added. I think this background is a bit too yellow, so I'm going to move the yellow slider toward the blue just a bit and maybe bring a bit of that green in. That looks pretty good. So click OK. Now it's prompting me to adjust the saturation of the background color. I kind of like the way this is looking, so I'm going to leave it there and click OK. Finally, it asks to adjust the opacity. Now you could set it to anything you like. Sean likes to start at 0 and slowly increase it until it looks really good. I think that works pretty well. And of course, we could always change that later. Click OK, and it moves us on to the next step, the face light. So the action analyzes the subject and creates a new light for the face that only affects the highlights and super highlights of our subject. So click continue. So it places the face light in the center of the image. As you can see, the light doesn't affect the background, it only affects the highlights in the subject. So position it where it looks good. Again, we can resize and reposition this using the handles. We can reshape it by holding the shift key, and we could turn the light to put it at an angle to her face. Okay, when we have it where we want it, hit the enter key. And that will bring up the next controller to adjust the opacity of the face light. Sean likes to add a nice glow to his subject's faces. You could set this to whatever you think looks good on your image and click OK. Remember, all these settings can be adjusted and tweaked later. Now it's prompting us to adjust the opacity of the shadow optimization. This step precedes a step for adding selective contrast to the image through dodging and burning. So as you can see, zero opacity adds nothing. And because we're going to be painting in more highlights in the next step, I'm going to make this quite a bit darker. Remember, we could always go back to this and lower it later. Click OK, and it brings us up to the next step where we could paint on additional highlights. So let's make sure that we note that the opacity should be 100, the flow should be 5%. It's also telling us to use these highlights to even out tonal inconsistencies, as well as sculpt and contour the subject. And finally, it's telling us to pay attention to the hair highlights, eyes, and cheeks. That's where you want to add the highlights. So let's click stop so we could do this. So first, let's zoom in. And let's get that brush flow down to 5%. And I'm looking for some tonal inconsistencies and start painting with lots of short strokes to bring up some of those dark spots and balance out those tones. Just kind of lightening up some of these dark spots. Maybe a little under the eyes. A subtle hand here goes a long way. You don't want to overdo it. Now zoom out to get a better look. I also like to use a nice big brush to kind of smooth out the highlights that I just painted in. Now I'm accentuating the highlights on her neck and her body. The shoulder's a little hot, so let's leave that one alone for now. And just follow the light. Keep following the highlights and adding just a bit more. Maybe just a little more under the eyes. And you could always come back to this adjustment layer and tweak this. Now on the hair. That's very important. Look for where the highlights are and let's punch those up. The idea here is that we're accentuating the highlights, and in the next step we're going to accentuate the shadows to make this image very three-dimensional. All right, done. Now let's go back to the highlighted Legacy Action button to continue with adding shadows. Okay, we're going to use the same brush settings, and the instructions are advising us to paint the shadows along the hairline, above the eyes, and accentuate where there are existing shadows. So let's click stop and let's do it. Okay, so zoom in and add some shadow above her eyes and on her brows. Just a little goes a long way. I'm going to use a smaller brush to kind of surgically paint shadows where we see shadows in her hair. This really adds dimension, especially in the hair. And then look for the shadows along the hairline where it meets the face. A bit more in the hair. Now we're going to look on the body where the shadows are and follow those shadows. Now her shoulder was a little hot and competing a bit with her face, so we can knock that down a bit here. Now you can always go back to the highlights layer to make adjustments too. I forgot to accentuate the highlights on her lips. So click in the dodge layer, make sure it's the layer mask, and paint up those highlights in her lips. And then click back into the burn mask and add a bit more shadow here. Okay, this looks pretty good. So click the highlighted action button again, and it says we've completed the legacy action. Keep in mind, you could go into any of these adjustment layers to tweak the masks, the adjustments, and the opacities to your liking. And when you're done tweaking, move on to the next action, which is Awesome Eyes. So the next action we're running is Awesome Eyes, so let's go. Keep in mind, we're using a brush with 100% opacity and 100% flow, and we're going to paint masks on these irises. Click stop so we could do it. Okay, let's zoom in, and let's get that brush to 100% flow, and then paint right along the iris to create the iris mask. Now, it's really bright because it's just guiding us to create the mask on the irises, so don't worry, we're going to adjust that back in the next step. Okay, great. Let's click the active button to adjust the brightness. Click continue, and we're going to adjust the opacity of this iris effect. And it automatically brings it down for you, but let's adjust it. This is 0, and that's 100. So we want to be somewhere in between. That looks natural. Click OK. Now we're prompted to change the color of the eyes using a curve adjustment layer. You might want to take a snapshot of these instructions so you can refer back to it. Let's click continue. Okay, so let's first adjust the RGB channel curve, which adjusts the brightness and contrast. Now I'm going to bring the darks down a bit to give her a really deep color. And this point affects the light parts. Now I want to make her eyes a bit greener, so I go into the green channel. And as you can see, I can boost the green or take it away. So I'm going to add a bit more green. Okay, that looks great. Let's click OK. Okay, now the action's going to sharpen the eyes. So click continue. And you can change the radius to what works. And this just depends on the size of your image. Click OK. Okay, now we're going to paint masks on the black parts of the eyeballs. It's telling me to make the brush flow 80%. Okay, so we changed the flow. Zoom in. Just paint in the center, don't worry about key lights. And reduce the size of the brush so I could follow the dark edge and some of her dark flecks in her eyes. And over to the other eye, hit the center, and then the edge, and those few little flecks. Zoom out. Okay, awesome. Click the activated button again, so we go to the next step. Okay, here we're going to paint masks on the white parts of the eyes. So set the brush opacity to 100% and the flow to 100%. Don't worry if it looks too dramatic, we could dial that back. Okay, zoom out to now adjust the opacity of the white parts to match the color parts. Now, the eyes have a bit too much effect right now, but I just want to balance the colors and the white. There, that looks pretty good. And finally, we can knock back the entire effect. Click continue. So it's a good idea now to zoom way out. Start at 0 and look for what looks natural, but amazing. I think that's right around there. And click OK. And we're done with Awesome Eyes. Again, we could go into each layer and tweak to get the optimum results. Okay, this image is looking fantastic. Let's run the vignetting action. Click the button and here we go. This action creates several vignette layers for you to choose from or combine according to your taste. After it runs, I just open my vignetting group and audition each vignette. The action also creates a mask for this layer group in case you like a vignette but you just want to mask away parts of it. Okay, marching forward, we go to number 4, split toning. Click the button and the action creates 12 split tone variations and places all the thumbnails into a single layer for comparison. Now I can toggle off the thumbnails layer and I can see below it the 12 individual tone layers. The action has pre-selected tone 8 as visible. So I could go back to the thumbnails and get a feel for what I like, or I can go in and turn on and off each tone layer to evaluate how it looks on the full image. I can also combine and mix them with varying opacities for different effects. I should mention that at any time I could delete any layers I'm not using to save memory. It won't affect how the actions run. Alright, that looks pretty good. Okay, this portrait's looking really terrific, and we're ready for the final step, finishing effects. This action creates a layer group with several different adjustment layers that can add different effects to the image. Okay, it ran. Open the finishing effects group and you'll see several adjustment layers turned off. Depending on how you've built your image so far will determine if and how much you actually need these adjustments. So you could just toggle them on and off to see how they look. By the way, this is the only action that creates a layer that covers over the actions below. It's called Painterly. So if you plan on doing some more tweaking on the layers you've already created, you should hide or delete this group, make your adjustments, and then rerun the finishing effects action. So I'm going to run through some final tweaks, making small adjustments to individual layers and masks to get that polished look I'm looking for. There. Perfect. The suite also created a before layer at the very top of the layers so you could compare your before and after image. Let's take a look. Before and after. Wow. That looks amazing. Well, we hope you love the Sean Archer portrait actions, and we wish you good luck in creating your next masterpiece.